Imagine a country with no military, no tanks, no fighter jets, not even a single active soldier. It sounds almost unthinkable in today's world, doesn't it? Yet, that's exactly the case for Iceland. This small Nordic island nation of just under 400,000 people is one of the very few countries on Earth without a standing army. And what makes it fascinating is that Iceland isn't a weak or fragile country. It's a stable, prosperous, and safe democracy. So how does it actually work? Why has Iceland chosen this path? And is it really as perfect as it sounds? Today, we're diving deep into the story of Iceland's no army policy, why it works, the benefits it brings, the hidden risks, and the surprising ways Iceland manages to stay secure in an often dangerous world. Iceland officially abolished its military back in 1869, when it was still under Danish rule. Since gaining full independence in 1944, the country never built its own standing army. Instead, it relies on a unique model: civilian security forces, Coast Guard patrols, and, importantly, strategic alliances with countries that do have militaries. Iceland has no air force, no navy, and no army. Its defense is primarily handled by its Coast Guard, 3 ships, a handful of helicopters, and about 200 personnel who monitor fishing zones, conduct search and rescue, and guard Icelandic waters. That's it. Instead of funding tanks and missiles, Iceland invests in education, healthcare, and renewable energy. And the results show. By some measures, it consistently ranks among the safest and happiest countries in the world. The natural first question is, how is this even possible? How can a country survive without a military in a world where wars and conflicts are still very real? The answer lies in Iceland's geography, its alliances, and its unique strategic position. First, Iceland is an island in the North Atlantic, far away from most global conflict zones. Its remoteness offers natural protection. Second, Iceland is a founding member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Even without its own military, Iceland benefits from NATO's collective defense agreement, meaning an attack on Iceland would be considered an attack on all 32 NATO members. The US, the UK, and other allies are committed to Iceland's security. And third, Iceland has historically hosted foreign troops during times of tension. For decades, the US operated an airbase at Keflavik, just outside Reykjavik. Though it closed in 2006, American forces still rotate through the country for training and surveillance. In short, Iceland has outsourced its defense. There are clear advantages to Iceland's no army model. The first is financial. Military spending can be a massive burden, especially for small countries. The United States, for example, spends around 3.5% of its GDP on defense, roughly $877 billion in 2023. By contrast, Iceland spends less than 0.25% of its GDP, mostly on its Coast Guard and NATO contributions. That's about $60 million a year, pocket change compared to most countries. That money goes elsewhere. Iceland has universal healthcare, heavily subsidized education, and invests heavily in clean energy. Nearly 100% of Iceland's electricity comes from renewable sources, mainly geothermal and hydroelectric power. Without a defense budget draining resources, Iceland can focus on building one of the most sustainable societies on Earth. Another benefit is safety. Countries with armies sometimes find themselves tempted or pressured into conflicts. Iceland has no such option. It projects itself as neutral, peaceful, and focused on diplomacy. As a result, Iceland ranks number 1 on the Global Peace Index, above countries like New Zealand, Ireland, and Denmark. And perhaps most importantly, the absence of a military shapes national culture. For Icelanders, national pride doesn't come from military power. It comes from literature, music, nature, and science. That creates a very different worldview compared to countries where the military dominates identity. But of course, this model isn't without risks. The world is unpredictable, and Iceland is not immune to potential threats. For example, Iceland's location in the North Atlantic makes it strategically important. It sits right between North America and Europe, controlling key air and sea routes. During the Cold War, the US used Iceland as a base to monitor Soviet submarines. Today, NATO still sees Iceland as a vital checkpoint for transatlantic defense. Without its own military, Iceland is entirely dependent on others for protection. If NATO were ever to weaken or fracture, Iceland could be left vulnerable. There are also concerns about cyber threats. In 2013, Iceland was one of the countries hit by cyber attacks believed to originate from Russia. Without a strong military cyber unit, it must rely on partnerships to defend its digital infrastructure. And finally, there's always the unpredictable factor of global politics. In theory, if NATO allies became distracted or unwilling to intervene, Iceland would have no way to defend itself. Critics argue that relying entirely on foreign protection leaves the country exposed to decisions beyond its control. While Iceland has avoided war for centuries, it hasn't been entirely free from conflict. One famous example is the Cod Wars with the United Kingdom. Between the 1950s and 1970s, Iceland and Britain clashed over fishing rights in the North Atlantic. British naval ships even confronted Icelandic Coast Guard vessels. At one point, Iceland threatened to leave NATO unless Britain backed down. The disputes never escalated into full military war, but they show how even small, unarmed nations can end up in dangerous situations. Iceland's Coast Guard, armed with nothing more than water cannons and ramming tactics, faced down one of the world's most powerful navies. In the end, Iceland won, expanding its fishing zone to 200 nautical miles, which remains one of its biggest economic lifelines today. But it's a reminder that Iceland's security is not guaranteed. Iceland's success without a military has led some people to ask, could other countries copy this model? The reality is that Iceland is unique. Its small population, geographic isolation, and NATO membership create a rare situation where no army is actually feasible. A country like Switzerland, for example, surrounded by larger neighbors and historically caught in wars, cannot afford to go without defense. Even other small nations like Luxembourg or Monaco maintain small armies for self-defense. Iceland is truly an outlier. What's more, Iceland's size works in its favor. With fewer than 400,000 people, it doesn't need to defend sprawling borders or contested territories. And its economy, based on tourism, fisheries, and renewable energy, is not heavily reliant on industries that make it a target. In short, Iceland's model works for Iceland, but it's not a one-size-fits-all blueprint. The biggest question now is whether Iceland's no-army approach can hold up in the 21st century. Climate change is reshaping the Arctic, opening new shipping lanes, and sparking interest in untapped resources. Iceland suddenly finds itself at the center of geopolitical attention. Both the US and China have shown increased interest in the region. If Arctic tensions rise, Iceland could be pulled into disputes it has little control over. Meanwhile, cyber warfare is becoming a bigger concern, with so much of Iceland's economy reliant on digital infrastructure like geothermal energy grids, airlines, and tourism platforms. Cyber attacks could be devastating. Some Icelanders argue that the country may eventually need at least a modest defense force, particularly to handle modern threats like drones or cybercrime. Others insist that diplomacy and alliances are still the smarter investment. So what can the rest of the world learn from Iceland's experiment in living without an army? First, that military power is not the only path to security. For Iceland, peace has come through diplomacy, alliances, and geography. Second, that redirecting resources away from weapons and toward people can pay off. By not spending billions on defense, Iceland has built one of the world's most advanced renewable energy systems, nearly eliminated poverty, and cultivated a strong cultural identity. But the third lesson is a warning. This model depends heavily on circumstances that not every country shares. Iceland's security is tied directly to NATO's strength and global stability. If either weakens, Iceland may face tough choices. Iceland is proof that in the 21st century, it is still possible for a nation to thrive without a military. It enjoys peace, prosperity, and some of the highest living standards on Earth. But it also walks a tightrope, balancing the benefits of disarmament with the risks of dependence. The big question is whether Iceland's model represents a glimpse of the future, or a fragile exception to the rule. Can peace really last without power? Or will global tensions one day test this small island nation's greatest gamble? What do you think? Should Iceland keep relying on diplomacy and NATO, or build at least a small defense force of its own?